Help Wanted 2, the most recent entry of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, has earned mostly nothing but praise. But a pretty sizable sentiment I've seen on the internet is that although it's a great VR game, it's not the best FNAF game. And I think those criticisms, while valid, are straight up wrong. In fact, I not only think that Help Wanted 2 is a great FNAF game, I think it's a perfect FNAF game. But to prove it, we're going to have to figure out exactly what that means and quantify perfection. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves some media critique. What makes a perfect FNAF game is, when you really boil it down, subjective. Any meaningful discussion on the quality of a video game can be completely thrown out the window with just two words: for you. There's a huge difference between the term perfect versus perfect for you. But in order to objectively talk about the quality of the game, I think boiling down the aspects of what makes Five Nights at Freddy's so iconic will be most useful. Then we can divvy them into categories, score those categories, and compare it amongst the rest of the franchise. So what are the main categories of the aspects of a Five Nights at Freddy's game? First and foremost, horror. It has to be scary. But scary how? I've always thought the strengths of FNAF rely on its realism, or rather, its ability to wield the uncanny valley. I'm not saying that these animatronics or any of the designs are realistic. In fact, it's incredibly high-tech for the time, and possession, as far as we're aware, is not a proven thing. So it's not that these games were ever realistic, but FNAF at its roots was very good at taking designs that could realistically be in a children's restaurant and be appealing, and rendering them and lighting them in such a way that makes them terrifying. I think probably the best example of this is to compare something like Lefty with Shattered Roxy. If you just present these two designs, Shattered Roxy is definitely, in my opinion, scarier than Lefty. She's more jagged, her face is missing. This is a scarier design. However, when they're utilized in game, I would argue it's the opposite. In Security Breach, Shattered Roxy is just wandering around in a very brightly lit, open environment. She's a constant threat, but she is fully known, and you can just walk around her, you see every part of her, you know exactly what she is. Compare that to the introduction of Lefty in FNAF 6. Sure, if you're playing your cards right, you can see him in the shop before you ever get to encounter him in the game, but assuming you don't see him in the shop, or even if you do but don't buy him, this is your first shot of Lefty. The salvage minigame, up close, personal, and barely lit. This is scary. This is really effective. This shot, in my opinion, is the essence of horror in Five Nights at Freddy's. Not to say that FNAF 6 is a particularly frightening game. The gameplay can be very unnerving, but it notoriously has some of the worst jump scares in it, having them just kind of hop into frame, freeze, and then fade to red. But to that point, another key part of horror in this franchise is the jump scares. It was built off of it. There are many opinions as to what makes a good jump scare in general, but especially so in the FNAF franchise. Typically, most people agree that a jump scare can feel effective or cheap depending on the context of the game and how it's utilized. Jump scares will always get a scare out of an audience, but if they're just thrown in for no reason, it feels cheap. You have to establish a tight bit of tension and an atmosphere for a jump scare to feel earned. A good frame of reference for if a jump scare feels earned or cheap is how it makes you feel after the fact. If your reaction is, ah, oh god, it's probably earned. But if your reaction is, ah, god damn it, then it's cheap. And that's horror for FNAF, but arguably even more important, I wouldn't say so, but some would, is the lore. It's not a hot take to say that the majority of the appeal of this franchise is its lore and mystery. We're not quite sure what's going on, but we keep getting just enough information to make an educated guess. Scott Cawthon, the creator, really didn't hit his stride with this until a little later in the franchise, probably around FNAF 3 or so. But even as early as the first game, he was smart enough to give us some breadcrumbs, hints as to what was really going on, conflicting answers to questions we had. I'd say for the lore of a FNAF game to function properly, it should be fulfilling but still keep some aspect of mystery. It should aim to give a few answers but provide more questions. It should give some hints but have them come from different sources and possibly have them conflict each other, so then you have to decide who to trust. In essence, good FNAF lore, in my opinion, gives us just enough to work with without holding our hands, and hopefully enough that multiple different theories can be valid. And finally, I think there's one other really necessary thing for a FNAF game to be a good FNAF game, and that's for it to be fun to play. FNAF gameplay can be repetitive if done poorly, and the core gameplay itself is inherently formulaic. So to stand amongst the best of the best, I think it either has to iterate upon the core FNAF gameplay in a way that makes it fun, or completely revolutionize the game. We're talking Help Wanted 1, Security Breach Help Wanted 2, so on and so forth. And some perfect examples of this, I think, can be found in the fan fan games and other associated games, not necessarily officially provided by Five Nights at Freddy's, and we'll get into why I think that later on. But a perfect example of this is not with a fan game, but a FNAF-inspired game, Playtime with Percy. It's a newer game in the community that again isn't a FNAF fan game, but is inspired by the gameplay of Five Nights at Freddy's. But it just innovates upon the core gameplay of FNAF in such a smart way that I had to bring it up. In this game, you're defending yourself against animatronics in an office using cameras and doors and the like. That makes sense. But the way that this game innovates is that not only does each animatronic have a specific and different way to defend yourself from, time doesn't pass. You're not just waiting and surviving and focusing on the animatronics. The only way to end the night is by doing enough tasks on your pal Percy. It's this Tamagotchi-inspired toy. So instead of just waiting, you have to balance your attention with this toy to the attention you give defending yourself. It's a built-in risk versus reward. How much time are you willing to risk devoted to pal Percy to speed through the night versus sacrificing time on that to focus on the animatronics? Taking it slow, taking longer, but being safer. This gameplay is then iterated upon again in the final night in a brilliant way, which is honestly one of the best last nights in any FNAF-styled game I've ever played. But to go see what I mean, go and download the game yourself. It's on GameJolt, it's free, it's so good. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, I just really like the game and wanted an excuse to bring it up. So in my opinion, a perfect FNAF game needs to score highly in horror, lore, and fun. What does this look like in action? Well, let's use my second favorite game in the franchise and a favorite amongst many fans, FNAF 1. FNAF 1 horror, in my opinion, is possibly the peak of the franchise when it comes to uncanny. The FNAF 1 designs perfectly fall into that middle ground we mentioned earlier, where realistically I could see these designs being appealing to children in a restaurant, but they are posed, lighted, and rendered in ways that make them terrifying. Now, not always. I've always thought this pose of Chica in the dining room is just straight up funny, but many of these angles are, and the majority of the shots here use the exact same models that we see at the beginning of the game, which is just a testament to how good Scott is at rendering these kinds of images. Even then, the very few shots where the model is changed, all that's added is these eyes. Instead of the weird, somewhat realistic eyes, you get these black orbs with white dots. This is incredibly effective because not only is it just kind of scary, but it's informing the player that something grander is happening here, possibly something paranormal. And Scott knows this, using it on incredibly close-up shots of Bonnie and the majority of Freddy shots. Speaking of Freddy, he's designed in such a way that it's honestly difficult to make him look threatening. He's inherently cuddly, which is probably why Scott chose to leave him in mostly darkness for almost all of his rendered shots, letting just his eyes illuminate to the player that he's there and maybe the edges of his face. The one time he's fully visible after this stage shot, he's way too close to the camera and his own face is obscuring the rest of his body. Foxy is also expertly done. Not only is he mostly behind a curtain that obfuscates the majority of his body, but when he does eventually get out of the curtain, he's contorted and twisted in strange ways that don't really convey what his actual shape is. It's inherently creepy, albeit the fear factor goes away once you see his jump scare. Cause like, sure, it's scary that he's the only one that can jump scare you while your camera is down, but objectively, this is probably the worst jump scare in the franchise. He just kinda leans at you. On that subject though, besides Foxy, I think FNAF 1 has some of the best jump scares in the franchise. They're quick, they're snappy, and although you can see the majority of each of these models, because they're so violent and fast, they're still obfuscated in a way. And although the majority of the jump scares in this game are death ones, which are then inherently earned because you've lost, 2 of them aren't death jump scares but still feel earned. And that's when you turn on a light to see Bonnie or Chica at the door. I would argue that these don't feel cheap because 1, you can avoid them if you're tracking them well enough on the camera, and 2, the environment and audio design of this game is just tense enough that when they happen, they get you. The jump scares are almost cathartic, a reassurance that a real threat is here, aided by the helplessness of the player. We can't run, we can't hide, and we can't fight back. The best we can do is delay the inevitable. All in all, even though I think there are some misses in terms of certain shots and jump scares, I'd like to give FNAF 1 an 8 out of 10 on horror. So what about lore? Famously, FNAF 1 is a bit light on lore, mainly because this was Scott Cawthon's Hail Mary. His other games weren't being being received very well, so this was kind of a last-ditch attempt to get something on the ground. Realistically, I don't think he then assumed this game would go on to spawn a 10-year franchise with a blockbuster movie. Even still, way back then he gave us enough lore to work with, which was a smart move. That something is what I think helped catapult this game into the social conversation. We had two sources of information in this game, the phone guy and the newspapers. Not only was it that not either one was necessarily a font of information, but at some points they necessarily contradicted. The phone guy would tell us things like they roam at night so their servers don't lock up. They try to kill you because they think you're an endoskeleton and want to put you in a suit. But then the newspaper articles tell us of children that go missing and suits that begin to stink, implying that these suits were then haunted by those kids that died. So all of this strange aggression would be due to possession. But then why would phone guy lie to us? Does he not know himself? Who killed these kids? When did it happen? Etc, etc. We get enough information to work with and no solid answers either way. Although, all in all, I want to give the lore of this game a 5 out of 10. It's not huge, nor is there a great amount, but again, there is enough to work with, so it's the bare minimum. Now, finally, is it fun? Well, to be honest, it doesn't innovate or revolutionize the FNAF formula, but to be fair, it can't. It's the game that created the FNAF formula. And I'd argue it's probably the FNAF game with the best gameplay until like maybe FNAF 4, if not then like Help Wanted. FNAF 2 is more frantic but more of the same, and FNAF 3 is notoriously incredibly easy. Meanwhile, FNAF 1 kinda got it just right. Track Chica and Bonnie with either the cameras or your doors, stall Freddy, check on Foxy. It's a simple formula, but obviously it worked since everyone and their mother likes making games using this formula. So I'm giving fun a 9 out of 10. Only because in retrospect, it's pretty straightforward and it feels unfair to criticize FNAF 1 for not iterating upon the FNAF 1 gameplay because it's literally the FNAF 1 gameplay. Like you can't iterate upon the first attempt. So all in all, FNAF 1 gets a 22 out of 30 on the scale, which isn't a perfect score. Hell, it isn't even a B. But here's the thing. Definitions are only as useful so much as they are used, and used in a way that many people can agree upon. Words are arbitrary by definition. They are defined as what we define them as, and definitions change all the time. So here's the skinny of it. Does the majority of the fandom consider FNAF 1 to be a perfect FNAF game? According to this poll, that I did, and I'm just going to assume that everyone agrees with it because this is a flawless methodology, sarcasm, yes. So if what the fandom considers a perfect FNAF game scores a 22 out of 30, then all we have to do is figure out if Help Wanted 2 also scores a 22 or above on this scale, thereby, by proxy, also being a perfect FNAF game. So how does the rest of the franchise score up against this? And I'm not going to go as in detail like I did with FNAF 1, here are the scores, I'm just going to give them to you. This video is long enough. And by these metrics, FNAF 4, Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator, and Help Wanted 1 are all technically perfect FNAF games, which I tend to agree with. Two of them are my favorites, actually. FNAF 6, not quite, because I'm just not very good at it, so I have a personal bias against it, but I admit it's an objectively good game. So, I hear you. Right, we are 2,100 words in the script. Talk about the damn game that's in the title of this video. So, what about Help Wanted 2? Horror, admittedly, is Help Wanted 2's weakest sector. Many of the games in Help Wanted 2 just straight up aren't scary at all. Things like arts and crafts, most of food prep, if not all of it, Captain Foxy's Cowboy Adventure, Phaser Blast, so on and so forth. While being really fun, there's really no fear there. Sure, if you lose, you get jump scared, but it feels more like a loss, not like a scare. Maybe this is just me being, oh, okay, bye. And sure, maybe I'm just desensitized, but I mean, hell, when I replay Help Wanted 1, Funtime Foxy still scares the shit out of me, and so does FNAF 1 and the Night Terrors levels. But even on the first playthrough of Help Wanted 2, I was very rarely frightened. Not to say that it's devoid of horror. When it does horror, it does some of the best horror that FNAF can. Sections like the Endo Warehouse and Breaker Room Yendo are genuinely terrifying, which is doubly impressive for something like Breaker Room Yendo. I've always thought of Yendo as one of the goofiest designs in the franchise. Nothing about this is frightening to me. And not only is he very silly looking, he's ridiculously utilized in his base game, basically being the Golden Freddy with a terrible jump scare to boot. But then, Help Wanted 2 followed the classic FNAF formula, and color me surprised when I played a minigame starring Yendo where I was terrified of him because they kept him in darkness, not even having his eyes tell you where he is, and just barely being able to see him. Suddenly, Yendo was terrifying. Now, I technically should also say that Moon is done well in this aspect as well, with Arts and Crafts Loft and Carousel, but it just didn't do it for me personally. I could see someone being scared by Moon in either of these minigames, but to me it was more of like a nuisance of trying to find him than a scare of, oh god, where did he go? In general, I think the sister location sections of the gameplay were the majority of where the horror lied. That's where the real scary stuff was versus the rest of the game. And that makes sense since a lot of it is the closest to traditional FNAF gameplays we get in this game. Funnily enough, I think there's more and better gameplay in the sister location section of Help Wanted 2 than in sister location. But from the way Ennard walks, to the pure speed of Funtime Foxy, and the intimidating presence of Circus Baby, sister location really does get horror well. And a lot of this game, while not horrifying, still can unsettle you with how high quality the models and animation is. The animation in this game is so good. And speaking of, that animation lends itself to the jump scares. Help Wanted 1 had notoriously probably the worst or second worst jump scares in the franchise. The worst jump scares are still always going to be Ultimate Custom Night, but a lot of Help Wanted's jump scares were just you're in a blank room and something shakes its face at you. Because it's VR, it's hard to do a jump scare justice in VR. But Help Wanted 2 seemingly fixed this, because although it still teleports you to a new location for the jump scares to not cause motion sickness, Steel Wool followed their gut on what they had been doing in Ruin. Instead of just being scary, death animations. That's really the evolution of jump scares that they need. Sure, it's something that jumps in your face and scares you, but then you see how you're about to die. In Ruin, it was stuff like the Mimic throwing you to the ground and about to crush your head. And in this one, it's Scrap Baby grabbing you, getting her claw ready, and going in for the kill. This jump scare is an insane improvement to the last jump scare Scrap Baby ever had. So it just hats off. The jump scares in this game are very good for a VR game. All in all, while I think the horror that is here is amazing, it's not even attempted all that often. So I think the best way to give this a good score would just say that the horror is a 6 out of 10. Majority of the game isn't that scary, but when it is scary, it's really scary. So what of the lore of Help Wanted 2? Well, this game is particularly interesting in that aspect. Simultaneously, it's one of the most abstract and hard to fully decipher games we've ever had, yet almost immediately the majority of the fan base agreed on major aspects of it, which never happens in a FNAF game, especially with things like the player. Pretty much like a week out, almost all of us agreed that the most likely candidate for the player is Cassie's dad, someone who we don't even have the name technically of. I think it's Jeremy Fitzgerald, but that's a whole nother theory. Meanwhile, in Security Breach itself, we get the name of Gregory, we see his model, and a lot of the fan base still doesn't agree who he is. So I think it's very impressive that they were able to lay down enough mystery groundwork that we can piece together who we're playing as, even if it's not very clear what we're doing. But in general, I think this game is a masterclass on how lore can be presented in Five Nights at Freddy's in the modern day. There are multiple bits of information coming from multiple sources in abstract ways, all with different levels of trustworthiness. Mystic Hippo, for example, on one hand gives us a lot of good information about ourselves. When we get the Faz wrench, she says this key is familiar to you. She'll urge us to look at our hands, really look at them. When are we? These lines give us a lot of insight about our player, but then she has this line.
Hello, can you hear me?
Which could be innocent, but it's also the first line that Glitchtrap ever says. And we know Glitchtrap's presence is all throughout this game, so is Mystic Hippo just Glitchtrap in a costume? And spoken lore isn't even the end of it, because again, other animatronics say other bits of lore, but there's visual lore in this game too. There's so much symbolism dripping through this game, between the plushes with paper masks of victims of William Afton, the implications of Faz Force, the fact that the background of the main crane machine where you get every item and prize in this game is a Fall Fest, an event that we have no information on but is seemingly incredibly important. Not to mention the crazy symbolism with both endings of the game and Princess Quest. This game has so many ways to interpret it, and many of them are valid but incredibly different, spanning over the past, present, and future of the timeline of these games. And I'm pretty sure it takes place on exactly where a lot of us wanted it to. A lot of us are very confused how we get from Help Wanted to Security security breach to ruin. There's a lot of missing gaps in there that we just needed more information for, and this game attempts to give us some of that information. But of course, as much as it's answering questions, it presents its own. 8-bit lore minigames don't really work in modern FNAF anymore, unless we go back to an older style of the game. They just don't make sense in a game like this. So, Help Wanted 2 did the brilliant thing of iterating upon an 8-bit lore minigame. Essentially, what is the point of an 8-bit lore minigame? The point, I think, is to give us some key information in a way that's abstract and interpretive. It tells us something that happened, but we have to make sense of it. It's not literally what happened, it's a representation. So in a game like Help Wanted 2, how do you achieve that with the Princess Quest ending? Do I think that Jeremy Fitzgerald, Cassie's dad, literally goes inside the Princess Quest machine, becomes the princess, and then gets put into a sister location elevator into a crane machine that Vanny takes Glitchtrap away from him through the crane machine? Do I think that literally happened? No. But do I think it's an abstract interpretation of something that did? Yes. It's just the 8-bit minigames again, but a lot prettier. For lore, this game gets a 10 out of 10, which is something I've only given FNAF 6 thus far, but it really earns it. And finally, to no one's surprise, fun. This game is so fun. Like, I love Help Wanted 1. It's probably my number 3 game in the entire franchise, but honestly, there's not a lot of replayability with it. A lot of Help Wanted 1's replayability comes in just playing the games that are recreated from earlier in the franchise, because everything besides FNAF 1 through 3 is just the same. Repairing the animatronics, doing the vent repairs, like all these minigames never change. They are always the exact same. And Steel Wool readily admits that this is a flaw of the game. The replayability is honestly pretty low. Meanwhile, all I want to do is continue to play Help Wanted 2, mainly because of how replayable and varied the gameplay is. The minigames have just enough random elements in it that it feels different every single time you play them. They don't feel stale, and luckily the minigames aren't always just fun or scary. There are some minigames like Carousel, the Endo Warehouse, and Ruin Roxy's Salon that do a pretty good job of being fun and scary, because a lot of Help Wanted 2's gameplay is perfect VR gameplay. It's the kind of game that doesn't really work well with a controller because there's a lot of different options all within a close proximity, but things that you can reach and grab for. They were really smart about doing that. Fazer Blast FNAF 2 and all of the food prep I could play forever. Those became not only one of my favorite FNAF games, but possibly my favorite VR game ever. All in all, I think fun is a solid 10 out of 10, which is something I've only given FNAF World. And yes, I did give FNAF World a 10 out of 10 in fun. It's a really fun game. Fight me. If you disagree, let me know in the comments, but I think that's true. Now, before we get to the score, I need to talk about one thing that doesn't fit in any of these categories, but I need to talk about it, so we'll call it an honorable mention. About halfway through the game, you're finally able to go into the back room that's been teasing you the entire time. And when you're in there, you find the inhibitors from Ruin. Turning it off, you realize that for the first half of this game, you had been wearing an AR mask, not seeing the world as it really is, literally grabbing it off of your face. I cannot tell you how cool this is. Like, being able to experience this for the first time playing it was a mind-blowing moment. It was so cool, it was pulled off so well, and I've never had a concept this well delivered like this ever in VR. The closest I've ever had to this is in Super Hot, where to access levels you put an in-universe VR helmet on. But even then, like, this is such an amazing moment that, like, the moment you realize you're wearing a mask and physically take it off, and the moment you go into Princess Quest are two of the best moments in the entire series, hands down. So in total, Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted 2 gets a 26, the highest scored game by this metric. By that measure, not only is Help Wanted 2 a perfect FNAF game, but by my estimations, it's the best FNAF game in the entire franchise. And I agree with that calculation. Steel Wool really knocked it out of the park with this one. And between this game and Ruin, I for one cannot wait to see what else Steel Wool gives us in this franchise. But in the meantime, if you want to know the whole story about these games, one of the most recent and I feel most conclusive summaries I've given is in last week's video about who the true antagonist is, which you can find right here. If you want your art featured on the channel, make sure to use #RightHost when you post it. And as always, a huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers. And until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.